In the American South of 1838, slavery was built on one sacred belief, that the enslaved had no power, no authority, and no soul worth fearing. But on one forgotten Mississippi plantation, that belief collapsed in the most disturbing way imaginable, because here, a white plantation master did something that would have gotten him killed by his own society. He knelt in secret before his own slave. What followed were deaths without wounds, prayers spoken backward in the woods, and a sealed room that no one dared open for 14 years. Tonight, you're about to step into a forbidden mystery the South tried to erase completely. In the spring of 1838, when the humid air of Charleston clung to the skin like a second punishment, and the cobblestone streets echoed with the muffled despair of human commerce, Nathaniel Crowder stepped into the slave auction yard with the confidence of a man who believed the world existed solely to serve him, yet beneath his tailored coat and polished boots stirred an unease he could not pray away. For Bellwood Plantation, his Mississippi empire of cotton and blood, had begun to betray him. Harvests withering despite fertile soil, livestock dying without illness, his wife Elizabeth waking each night screaming from dreams she refused to describe, and neighbors whispering that the land itself had turned against him. And so Crowder came not merely to purchase labor, but to silence whatever invisible force had begun clawing at the foundations of his power, unaware that the auction block before him would deliver the very thing his society feared most. A man who carried something slavery was never designed to contain. The enslaved were lined shoulder to shoulder beneath the sun, bodies catalogued like furniture, their worth shouted by traders whose voices had grown numb to cruelty. When Crowder noticed one figure standing unnaturally still, neither pleading nor resisting, eyes lowered yet alert, skin marked with scars that were not the chaotic violence of whips, but deliberate, symmetrical carvings that followed sacred geometry unknown to Christian men, symbols etched deep into flesh as if meant to survive drowning, chains, and forgetting itself. And when Crowder asked the trader what manner of slave bore such markings, the man spat and warned him that this one had been trouble since the coast, refusing to beg, refusing to break, muttering in a language that unsettled even hardened sailors. A heathen priest, they said, taken from deep inland, educated beyond his station, dangerous not because he fought, but because others listened. And though sensible planters turned away, Crowder felt something tighten inside him, not fear, but recognition, the sick curiosity of a man accustomed to domination sensing a force he could not name, and so against advice, against instinct, he bid on the man, purchasing him for a price so low it bordered on mockery, later recording him in plantation books under the name Emmanuel, a Christian theft meant to overwrite whatever identity had crossed the ocean intact. Yet, from the moment Emmanuel stepped onto Crowder's carriage, the horses refused to move. The driver crossed himself without knowing why, and the cicadas fell into an unnatural silence that followed them all the way to the docks. The journey to Mississippi unfolded under omens Crowder would later claim not to remember. Storms that broke without warning, ropes snapping clean as if cut by unseen blades, sailors waking from nightmares speaking words they did not know, while Emmanuel remained silent, gaze fixed on the horizon, fingers tracing invisible patterns against his leg, not in prayer, but in preparation. And when Bellwood Plantation finally rose from the mist days later, its white columns gleaming like a temple built on bones, the enslaved community felt Emmanuel's arrival before they saw him, elders straightening as if struck by memory, children falling quiet, women averting their eyes not in submission but in recognition. Although they did not know his name, they knew his markings, knew what kind of man survived the Middle Passage without screaming, and Crowder, watching from the veranda, felt the first crack in the lie he had built his life upon, that ownership equaled control, for Emmanuel did not bow as expected, did not avert his gaze long enough to signal fear, and though he obeyed commands, there was no surrender in him, only patience, the kind that waits for tides to turn. Within days, Crowder began noticing disturbances he could not attribute to discipline or chance. The dogs refused to track Emmanuel. Overseers complained of headaches after striking him. Prayers spoken at the dinner table felt hollow and unfinished, and at night Crowder dreamed of hands emerging from soil, not to grasp him but to judge, and though he told himself Emmanuel was merely another slave, another asset, something about the man's presence gnawed at the very logic of slavery itself, suggesting a hierarchy beneath the surface, a power that did not require permission. And before Crowder could name this terror, before he could retreat from the choice he had made, Bellwood Plantation had already begun to shift, unseen forces aligning, histories waking from dormancy, the purchase complete, the door opened, and the forbidden story set into motion. And if you want to continue walking into these buried truths, the South tried to erase, subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon, and stay with us, because what follows proves that the most dangerous thing slavery ever encountered was not rebellion, but remembrance. By the time the carriage dust settled and Emmanuel's shadow stretched across Bellwood's packed earth, the plantation had begun to behave as though it recognized him, not as property, but as a presence. And this recognition manifested first in small disobediences that white men dismissed as coincidence, and the enslaved understood as warning. For the morning bells rang late without explanation, the well rope frayed overnight, though no hand had touched it, and the dogs, trained to hunt runaways through swamps and blood, refused to pass the tree line nearest the quarters where Emmanuel was assigned. Standing rigid with hackles raised as if scent itself had turned against them, Crowder noticed these things in fragments, irritations that snagged his attention between ledger entries and sermons. Yet Emmanuel noticed everything, because men like him had been taught to read the world when the world refused to read them, and so, as he was put to work repairing fences and clearing brush, he listened not to commands but to the land, to the way the soil sighed underfoot, to the insects that fell silent when overseers approached, to the elders who brushed past him and murmured proverbs that were not proverbs at all but questions shaped like prayers. And though he spoke little, Emmanuel's silence was not empty but crowded, full of names unspoken and roots remembered, for he had crossed water with memory intact, carrying a lineage that had survived burning, selling, and the deliberate violence of forgetting. And now that lineage had arrived at a place built on denial, a place that would resist him not with chains alone but with the weight of its own lies. Within the first week, an overseer named Calhoun, known for his relish in punishment, collapsed in the fields after striking Emmanuel with a riding crop, his face drained of color, blood seeping from his nose and ears while he babbled about a pressure behind his eyes. And though the doctor later blamed heat and drink, the enslaved whispered that Calhoun had been answered, a word that traveled the quarters like a current, subtle but electric. And Crowder, hearing of the incident, felt an anger sharpened by unease, because punishment was supposed to produce obedience, not consequences, and yet when he confronted Emmanuel demanding to know what trick he had played, Emmanuel met his gaze with a calm that was neither defiant nor submission, explaining in careful English that some actions called things into motion, whether one believed in them or not, a statement Crowder dismissed as heathen nonsense even as it lodged itself beneath his ribs. That night, Elizabeth Crowder dreamed again, only this time the dream had shape and sound, drums echoing beneath the floorboards, not loud but steady, synchronized with her heartbeat, and when she woke gasping, she found Nathaniel sitting upright beside her, hands trembling, because he too had heard something, a low rhythm rising from the earth itself, and though they searched the house and found nothing, the sound lingered, unresolved, like a question left unanswered. Days passed, and Emmanuel was reassigned from field labor to tasks that kept him closer to the house, repairs, deliveries, errands that brought him into spaces where enslaved men were usually unseen. And with each movement, the plantation's invisible order shifted, small alignments rearranging, people who had not spoken in years exchanging glances heavy with meaning, elders teaching children songs disguised as lullabies, cymbals scratched into the dirt and swept away before dawn, and Crowder, sensing a loss of control he could not quantify, increased patrols, enforced harsher discipline, and ordered prayer meetings meant to reassert Christian dominion over a place that felt increasingly ungovernable. Yet the prayers fell flat, words echoing back unchanged, while Emmanuel's quiet rituals, performed not as spectacle but as maintenance, began to knit the enslaved community into something coherent and dangerous, not rebellion but remembrance, a reassembly of selves fractured by sail and whip. The second death came without spectacle. A white neighbor who had visited Bellwood to complain about Negro influence collapsing during supper, choking as if the air had thickened around him, and though doctors again offered explanations, Crowder could not ignore the pattern forming at the edges of his awareness, each incident preceded by Emmanuel's presence and followed by a tightening of the plantation's collective posture, as if something ancient had been fed and was now awake. And this awakening unsettled Crowder, not because he feared Emmanuel's power, but because he felt himself drawn toward it, his certainty eroding under the weight of unanswered questions, his sermons feeling thin against experiences they could not contain, until one evening, compelled by a mixture of dread and fascination, he followed Emmanuel beyond the fields into the woods, where the enslaved gathered not to plot escape but to remember who they had been before they were named by others, and hidden among the trees, Crowder watched as Emmanuel traced symbols in ash and earth, not invoking but aligning, speaking softly to a circle that included no whites yet addressed forces older than any plantation, and in that moment Crowder felt the world tilt, his authority reduced to a costume worn by someone who had mistaken violence for power, and though he fled before being seen, the knowledge followed him back to the house, settling into his bones, because he had glimpsed a hierarchy slavery could not reverse, a system in which ownership meant nothing and belief meant everything, and from that night on, Bellwood Plantation did not merely contain Emmanuel. It listened to him, responding in ways that would soon demand a price no ledger could record. After that night in the woods, when Nathaniel Crowder returned to his house with the taste of ash in his mouth and the certainty that he had witnessed something older than Scripture, Bellwood Plantation entered a phase that could not be reversed, because belief, once cracked, does not shatter cleanly but fractures along hidden lines, and Crowder found himself moving through his own home, like a guest who had overstayed his welcome, listening for sounds that were not there yet, feeling watched by walls that had never judged him before. While Emmanuel Company continued his days as though nothing had changed, mending gates, carrying water, bowing his head when spoken to. Yet beneath that obedience ran a current of deliberate restraint, for Emmanuel understood that true power did not announce itself. It waited until the moment authority exposed its own weakness, and that moment came gradually, carried in Crowder's sermons that grew longer and less convincing, in his prayers that wandered into questions, in the way his hand trembled before striking a slave and then fell uselessly to his side, as if the act itself had lost meaning. The enslaved noticed first, because they were trained by necessity to read hesitation as opportunity, and so they began to approach Emmanuel not openly but through layers of ritualized normalcy. An elder woman asking for a blessing disguised as a request for herbs, a man asking for help with pain that medicine could not name, mothers bringing children to sit near him not for instruction but proximity, and Emmanuel responded with care that never crossed into spectacle, teaching them to breathe together, to remember names erased by sale, to anchor themselves to rhythms older than the auction block, and this quiet recentering began to alter behavior across the plantation, reducing fights, slowing work not through resistance but coordination, creating a calm that infuriated overseers who could not punish serenity without revealing their own fear. Crowder, observing these changes, felt a contradiction tearing at him, because the order he had enforced through violence was dissolving, yet productivity remained, and worse, the enslaved no longer met his gaze with the vacant submission he relied upon to affirm himself, but with something steadier, something that made him feel suddenly exposed, and so he did what men like him had always done when certainty faltered. He sought to dominate the source of his unease, summoning Emmanuel to the study late one night, locking the door behind them, demanding an explanation not as master, but as a man grasping for ground. And Emmanuel listened, not interrupting, while Crowder raged about heathen practices and disorder in God's will, until the words collapsed under their own weight, leaving only silence thick enough to bruise. And in that silence, Emmanuel spoke not of gods but of balance, explaining that power taken without consent poisons both the taker and the land, that slavery had inverted the natural order by pretending ownership could replace relationship, and that Bellwood was sick, not because of curses but because it was built on rupture. A truth Crowder rejected aloud even as his body responded to it, his knees weakening, his breath shortening, because somewhere beneath his training he recognized the accuracy of the diagnosis. After that meeting, Crowder's behavior shifted in ways that disturbed everyone, white and black alike, as he began granting small permissions without explanation, reducing punishments, lingering near Emmanuel with a fascination that bordered on reverence, watching his hands as though they held answers Scripture had withheld, and this visible softening emboldened some and frightened others, particularly Elizabeth Crowder, who sensed that whatever had entered their lives was pulling her husband away from her and towards something she could neither name nor compete with, and so she sought counsel from the church, from neighboring wives, from anyone who would reassure her that this was a phase. Yet reassurance failed when the third and fourth deaths followed, not dramatic but precise. Men who had attempted to confront Emmanuel found alone and unmarked, eyes clouded as if they had stared too long into something vast, and though no evidence linked Emmanuel to these deaths, rumor did what law could not, spreading fear that pressed against Crowder's conscience like a hand, forcing him to choose between denying what he felt and surrendering to it, and slowly, disastrously, he chose surrender, not because H.E. believed Emmanuel a god, but because Emmanuel represented a coherence his world lacked, a system where meaning preceded authority, and so Crowder began to kneel, not publicly, not yet, but in private moments when he thought himself unseen, lowering himself in Emmanuel's presence not as penance but inquiry, asking questions about fate and consequence, and whether redemption existed for men who had built lives on theft, and Emmanuel answered honestly, explaining that redemption was not absolution, that it required dismantling what one benefited from, a requirement Crowder heard but did not yet accept because the cost was unimaginable. This imbalance between understanding and action created a tension that Bellwood could not contain, manifesting in nightmares that afflicted the house, in crops that grew unevenly, in clocks that stopped at the same hour each night, and as the plantation strained under the weight of truth surfacing too quickly, Emmanuel grew increasingly withdrawn, conserving his energy, because he sensed that Crowder's fascination was turning dangerous, slipping from curiosity into obsession, from respect into dependence, and dependence, Emmanuel knew, was another form of enslavement, one that disguised itself as devotion. And so when Crowder finally asked him, voice shaking, to teach him, to initiate him into the knowledge that had undone everything, Emmanuel refused, gently but firmly, explaining that such knowledge could not be transferred like property, that it required humility incompatible with ownership, and this refusal marked the true beginning of the end, because Crowder, confronted with a boundary he could not cross, felt the familiar rage of entitlement resurface, suspicion, then resentment, as she watched her husband drift further from her and closer to the shadow Emmanuel cast, and she responded in the only way she knew how, by asserting her place within the hierarchy, ordering harsher discipline for women she accused of gathering too closely, policing movement with renewed cruelty, attempting to fracture what she could not understand. But her actions only intensified the contrast between her brutality and Emmanuel's restraint, pushing more people toward him not as a leader but as a refuge, and this imbalance reached a breaking point when a child fell ill, seized by fever so violent the plantation doctor pronounced him lost, and his mother, driven by desperation rather than belief, carried him to Emmanuel at night, pleading not for miracles but mercy. And Emmanuel, knowing the danger of visibility yet refusing to turn away suffering, worked quietly with herbs, breath, and ritual that centered the child's body rather than attacking the illness, and by morning the fever had broken, a recovery so undeniable it spread through Bellwood faster than any rumor before it, igniting something close to hope among people trained never to expect it. And when Crowder learned of this, his reaction was not gratitude but terror, because healing was proof, and proof demanded explanation, and explanation threatened exposure, and so he called a meeting of neighboring planters under the guise of fellowship, inviting men whose authority depended on the same fragile myths as his own, and over drinks and scripture he planted seeds of concern, speaking of unrest, of superstition, of the danger of allowing African practices to take root, framing Emmanuel not as a spiritual force, but a contagion, a destabilizer who threatened not just Bellwood, but the order of the region itself. And the men listened, some dismissive, others uneasy, because they too had felt the tremors of change beneath their feet, and when one admitted that strange deaths had occurred on his land as well, unexplained and quietly forgotten, Crowder recognized opportunity, weaving these fragments into a narrative of collective threat that transformed personal fear into shared justification. Plans began to form, cautious and indirect, because no one wanted blood on their hands without the protection of consensus, and so they agreed to observe, to gather evidence, to wait for Emmanuel to make a mistake that could be framed as rebellion or sorcery or worse, while Crowder returned home buoyed by the illusion of control, unaware that in mobilizing against Emmanuel he had only accelerated the reckoning he feared, because Emmanuel sensed the shift immediately, the tightening of surveillance, the tension in the air, the way conversations stopped when white men approached, and he began preparing not for escape but endurance, teaching the enslaved subtle practices of grounding and memory that could survive his absence, reminding them that knowledge did not reside in one body but moved through community. And this preparation took on urgency as signs accumulated, animals refusing certain feed. In the room shifted, the air thickening, the witnesses later swearing. They felt pressure in their chests, a ringing in their ears, and Crowder, panicking, lashed out physically, striking Emmanuel for the first time since the night in the woods, an act that felt to him like reclamation but landed instead like a confession, because the moment his hand connected, he screamed, collapsing as if the blow had rebounded through his own body, and though Emmanuel stood unharmed, Crowder lay shaking, reduced, his authority exposed as performance, and the men behind the door fled, carrying with them not proof of sorcery but certainty of danger, and from that night forward, Bellwood Plantation existed in a state of countdown. As alliances hardened, fear replaced curiosity, and the question was no longer whether Emmanuel would be destroyed, but what would happen to those who tried, because the land itself seemed to be watching now, patient and unforgiving, waiting for the final violation that would demand payment in full. From the moment Crowder collapsed beneath the weight of his own violence, Bellwood ceased to be merely a place and became a pressure, a living enclosure where every footstep seemed to echo longer than it should, and every silence carried intention, because power, once revealed as fragile, invites replacement, and both sides of the plantation felt the shift immediately. Though they understood it in different ways, Crowder recovered physically as rejection, igniting the same wounded entitlement that had driven his earlier violence, and as his frustration grew, the plantation itself seemed to respond. Storms arriving without warning, splitting trees near the house but sparing the quarters, livestock refusing to enter certain pastures, clocks stopping simultaneously at the same hour each night, phenomena that Elizabeth dismissed as hysteria, but which the enslaved recognized as signs of imbalance approaching rupture. It was during this period that the deaths resumed, no longer isolated or ambiguous but unmistakably connected to confrontation, for an overseer who had beaten a woman suspected of carrying Emmanuel's influence was found dead beside the road, body intact, but face frozen in terror, and when another man attempted to rally a night patrol to capture Emmanuel, he collapsed before dawn, blood streaming from his eyes as though his body had rejected something unseen. And these deaths fractured the remaining consensus among the white men, some arguing that Emmanuel must be destroyed immediately, others urging distance, containment, denial, because they understood that killing him might confirm the very power they wished to dismiss. And this hesitation infuriated Elizabeth, who believed delay only deepened humiliation, and so she acted alone, orchestrating a confrontation designed not to punish Emmanuel, but to expose him publicly, arranging a forced gathering under the pretense of discipline, dragging the enslaved into the open to witness what she believed would be the collapse of their quiet center. But Emmanuel met this spectacle with composure that drained it of meaning, standing silently, refusing to perform either fear or defiance. And when Elizabeth accused him of witchcraft and rebellion, demanding he renounce his practices, he replied only that nothing he carried belonged to her to forbid, words that struck with a force no shout could match, because they articulated a boundary the entire system depended upon erasing. And in that moment something broke irreparably, for Elizabeth raised her hand to strike him and found herself unable to move, frozen by a paralysis that spread through the gathering, men and women alike rooted in place, as if the ground itself had seized them. And in that suspended instant, Emmanuel spoke, not loudly, not angrily, but with clarity that cut through panic, reminding those who listened that power taken by force corrodes the taker, that ownership poisons relationship, that balance always reasserts itself eventually. And when movement returned, Elizabeth collapsed sobbing, humiliated before those she sought to dominate, while Crowder watched from the edge, his face reflecting not relief but devastation, because he understood now that Emmanuel's power did not seek his submission but rendered it irrelevant. And irrelevance was the one fate Crowder could not survive. From that day forward, Bellwood existed in open division, authority contested not through violence but presence, with Emmanuel at the quiet center of one reality and the Crowders clinging desperately to another. And as outside scrutiny intensified, neighbors whispering, ministers inquiring, rumors spreading beyond control, plans were made in secret to end the situation definitively, because the plantation elite agreed on one thing at last, that Bellwood could not continue as it was, that either Emmanuel would disappear or the illusion of mastery across the region would collapse with him. And as these plans took shape, Emmanuel prepared himself not for survival but conclusion, understanding that his role had reached its final movement, and that whatever happened next would not be about him alone, but about what Bellwood would become when the reckoning it had delayed for generations finally arrived. By the time the decision was made to remove Emmanuel, Bellwood Plantation no longer felt anchored to ordinary time, because consequence, once set in motion, compresses moments until days feel like hours and hours feel like held breaths, and those who believed themselves architects of this final act mistook urgency for control, not realizing that what they planned was less an execution than a confession. The men who gathered in secret did not speak Emmanuel's name aloud, referring to him instead as the matter or the problem, as though language itself might grant him further reach, and they constructed their plan with legal precision, framing his disappearance as relocation, punishment, or sale, anything that could be explained on paper, because they understood that the true danger was not Emmanuel's presence, but the story of what had occurred at Bellwood, escaping their containment, and so they agreed to act swiftly, decisively, and above all quietly, arranging for Emmanuel to be seized at night and confined in the old storage room beneath the main house, a place long unused and long forgotten, its door reinforced and its key kept by Elizabeth Crowder herself, who insisted on overseeing the operation as proof that she had not been broken by earlier humiliations. Crowder, informed only after arrangements were finalized, protested weakly, not because he believed Emmanuel innocent, but because some part of him recognized that this act would sever the last thread binding him to meaning. Yet his objections carried no authority now, dismissed as the ramblings of a man already compromised. And so, on the appointed night, while the plantation slept under a moonless sky heavy with clouds, the overseers moved, surrounding Emmanuel as he finished his evening work, expecting resistance and prepared for violence, but he offered neither, submitting calmly, his stillness unsettling those tasked with restraining him, because they could not tell whether he had resigned himself to fate or orchestrated it. And as he was led away, the enslaved watched without intervention, not from fear but trust, understanding that Emmanuel's power did not require rescue to fulfill its purpose. Confined beneath the house, Emmanuel was left alone in darkness thick with the scent of earth and rot, and those above believed the problem contained. Yet containment is not the same as resolution, and almost immediately the house began to react, floorboards groaning as if settling into new positions, candles extinguishing themselves without wind, Elizabeth waking repeatedly to the sound of chanting she could not locate, while Crowder wandered the halls sleepless, drawn unconsciously toward the locked door beneath which Emmanuel sat in meditation rather than despair, grounding himself not against what was coming, but through it, because he understood that erasure required participation, and he would not provide it. By morning, the plantation was already destabilizing, workers refusing to enter the fields closest to the house, animals bolting without cause, the air carrying a pressure that made breathing feel deliberate. And when Elizabeth descended to confront Emmanuel, determined to extract confession or submission, she found him sitting upright, eyes open, expression neither defiant nor pleading, and her prepared speech faltered, replaced by accusations she barely believed herself, demanding he renounce his practices, confess to the deaths, absolve her husband of influence, and Emmanuel listened patiently, replying only that what had happened at Bellwood was not his doing alone, that systems produce outcomes, and that responsibility shared could not be isolated to one body, words that enraged Elizabeth because they denied her the clarity of blame, and in a final attempt to reclaim dominance she struck him, the sound echoing unnaturally through the space, and for a moment she felt triumph, until the lights above flickered and went out entirely, plunging the house into darkness so complete it felt intentional, and screams erupted as people stumbled, falling, colliding, the order they relied upon dissolving in seconds, and in that chaos Crowder found D himself at the cellar door, key in hand, compelled by a force he did not understand, opening it not to free Emmanuel, but to witness whatever truth had been sealed away. And as the door swung open, the air shifted, carrying a scent like rain after fire, and Emmanuel rose slowly, not stepping forward but standing as presence itself, and Crowder, overwhelmed, fell to his knees again, not in worship now but in recognition, because he understood finally that what he had mistaken for reverence was exposure, that Emmanuel had not inverted the hierarchy by force but by revealing its emptiness, and this realization broke him more completely than any curse could have, because it required him to see himself without myth, without justification, without escape. The others fled, sealing the door behind them, not to trap Emmanuel but to deny what they had seen, and in the days that followed they told stories that contradicted one another, claiming Emmanuel had escaped, been sold, died of illness, anything that preserved the fiction of order, while Elizabeth retreated into silence, refusing to open the locked room again, and Crowder withdrew entirely, speaking rarely, aging rapidly, as though the weight of delayed accountability compressed his remaining years, and yet despite their efforts, Bellwood did not recover. Productivity collapsed. Labor slowed not from resistance but grief, because something essential had been violated, and the enslaved carried Emmanuel's teachings quietly, not as ritual but orientation, grounding themselves in memory and connection, ensuring that what the plantation attempted to erase would persist beyond its walls. And as outside scrutiny intensified, newspapers questioning unexplained deaths, officials arriving to inspect irregular records, the Crowders realized too late that disappearance was not erasure, that absence could be louder than presence, and that by attempting to bury Emmanuel they had created a silence so conspicuous it demanded explanation, setting in motion the final unraveling that Bellwood could no longer postpone, because consequence, once denied long enough, does not arrive as punishment but as collapse, and the plantation stood now on the brink of that collapse, its fate sealed not by Emmanuel's power, but by the choices made in fear by those who believed themselves immune to reckoning. In the weeks following Emmanuel's confinement and the hurried sealing of explanations around his disappearance, Bellwood Plantation entered a phase that no ledger could record and no sermon could interpret, because what remained was not chaos, but an unnatural stillness, a silence so deliberate it felt instructed, as though the land itself had been told to wait, and those who lived within it began to understand that erasure does not end a story but changes how it moves, because Emmanuel's absence did not remove his influence but dispersed it, dissolving his presence into the daily rhythms of the enslaved, who now carried his teachings not as ritual but reflex, breathing differently, working with an awareness that made obedience appear intact while inwardly severing its hold, and this subtle shift unsettled the overseers more than open resistance ever had, because they could punish defiance but not composure, could whip bodies but not orientation, and so they lashed out blindly, increasing discipline without cause, attempting to provoke reactions that never arrived, which only deepened their frustration and accelerated their unraveling. Crowder, meanwhile, retreated almost entirely from public life, locking himself in the upper rooms of the house, staring out over fields he no longer recognized as his, because ownership without belief had begun to feel absurd, and in the quiet hours before dawn, followed him, because confession without accountability offers no relief, only exposure, and this exposure manifested physically as well, his body weakening, his hands trembling, his sleep haunted by dreams in which the plantation dissolved into roots and bones, leaving him standing alone atop foundations that could no longer support him. Elizabeth Crowder, by contrast, refused introspection entirely, hardening herself into vigilance, patrolling the house as though Emmanuel might reappear if she relaxed for even a moment, guarding the locked room beneath the stairs with obsessive devotion, sleeping with the key beneath her pillow, convinced that whatever power she had witnessed could not act unless invited, and so she devoted herself to denial as a form of defense, refusing to speak Emmanuel's name, refusing to acknowledge the deaths, refusing to engage with neighbors who now avoided Bellwood as though it were cursed, and this isolation fed her paranoia, for without external affirmation her authority collapsed inward, turning suspicion into certainty that everyone around her was complicit in an unspoken conspiracy. Rumors, meanwhile, spread beyond the plantation despite the elite's efforts to contain them, carried by traders, ministers, and travelers who noticed inconsistencies in records, gaps in property deeds, stories that changed depending on who told them, and when officials arrived to investigate the unexplained deaths and labor disruptions, they were met with rehearsed explanations that failed to align, prompting deeper scrutiny that the Crowders could not deflect indefinitely, because power relies on coherence, and Bellwood had lost it. Its narrative fractured beyond repair, among the enslaved, grief and resolve intertwined, because Emmanuel's disappearance was understood not as defeat but transition, a final lesson in impermanence that demanded responsibility, and so elders began teaching openly what had once been whispered, embedding memory into songs, gestures, and shared labor, ensuring that no single act of violence could erase what had been collectively absorbed, and this quiet continuity unsettled white authority more than Emmanuel's presence ever had, because it demonstrated that control had always been an illusion maintained by fear rather than fact. As months passed, Crowder's health deteriorated rapidly, his decline observed with a mixture of pity and indifference by those who no longer saw him as central to their survival, and when he finally emerged one evening to address the plantation, attempting to reassert order through a speech that echoed old sermons, his words fell flat, received without reaction, because belief cannot be commanded once it has been withdrawn, and this public failure marked the final collapse of his authority, leaving Elizabeth to manage the estate alone, a task she approached with ruthless efficiency that could not compensate for the rot beneath, because labor slowed, yields diminished, and the land itself seemed resistant, crops failing in patterns no farmer could explain. It was during this decline that the final deaths occurred, not sudden or violent but inevitable, men who had been most aggressive in pursuing Emmanuel succumbing to illnesses that mirrored their cruelty, wasting away in isolation, their passing noted briefly and then forgotten, because Bellwood had exhausted its capacity for spectacle, and what remained was consequence unfolding without audience. Elizabeth, witnessing this attrition, retreated further into denial, refusing to acknowledge cause or pattern, until one night she heard movement beneath the floorboards, not chanting now but breathing, slow and steady, and though terror seized her she did not open the door, because by then she understood that what waited beneath was not Emmanuel but the truth she had avoided, and truth once recognized cannot be contained by locks. When Crowder died quietly in his sleep shortly thereafter, his passing marked not an E, but an absence so complete it felt like subtraction, and without him, Bellwood existed only as a shell maintained by habit rather than purpose, its future uncertain, its past unstable, and as officials finally moved to dissolve the estate under mounting irregularities, Elizabeth vanished from public view, retreating into the house that no longer recognized her as its keeper, leaving behind a property riddled with omissions, sealed rooms, and questions that would trouble those who inherited the land long after its original inhabitants were gone. Yet despite these efforts to erase, the story of Bellwood persisted, surfacing decades later in fragments, missing records, altered maps, whispered accounts of a plantation where hierarchy inverted without rebellion, where a master knelt and a slave taught without claiming authority. And though Emmanuel's name rarely appeared, his influence remained legible to those who knew how to read absence, because silence, when imposed deliberately, speaks with an insistence that no narrative can fully suppress, and Bellwood's silence became its testimony, a warning embedded in landscape and memory that power denied accountability eventually devours itself, leaving behind not ruins but echoes that refuse to fade. Years passed after the collapse of Bellwood Plantation, but time did not soften what had happened there. Instead, it sharpened it, carving the absence into the land so deeply that those who later walked its fields felt unease without knowing why, because some places do not forget. They wait, and when the estate was finally broken apart by courts citing irregular deeds, missing inventories, and unexplained deaths that no one could satisfactorily account for, the official language used to dissolve Bellwood was cold and procedural, deliberately stripped of meaning, yet even in those documents gaps remained where explanations should have been, whole seasons unaccounted for, names crossed out and replaced with vague references like relocated or deceased by unknown causes, and these absences became the final proof that erasure had been attempted too aggressively, because history tolerates neglect but resists deliberate concealment. Elizabeth Crowder lived out her remaining years inside the house, refusing to sell it, refusing to open the locked room beneath the stairs, refusing even to acknowledge the rumors that followed her whenever she ventured into town, and when she finally died, alone and nearly forgotten, the key was found still tied around her neck, worn smooth by years of nervous handling, a symbol not of control but of fear preserved long past its usefulness. And when the room was finally opened by strangers with no emotional investment in what they might find, there was nothing inside that could be catalogued, no body, no markings, no artifacts that fit the expectations of those who believed the story should end with proof, only the unmistakable sense that the space had been used for something that resisted classification, something that had passed through rather than remained, and this lack of evidence frustrated officials who wanted closure, because systems built on dominance require tangible conclusions, while what had happened at Bellwood existed in a realm that did not obey their rules. Among the formerly enslaved and their descendants, however, Emmanuel was never considered missing, because disappearance is not the same as erasure when memory is protected collectively, and his name lived on not as legend but as orientation, woven into stories told to children about balance, about the danger of believing ownership equals power, about the quiet strength of refusing to perform submission even when survival demands obedience, and these stories were never told loudly or publicly, not because of fear but respect, because Emmanuel had taught them that truth does not need spectacle to endure, it needs continuity. And so his influence traveled outward through generations, subtle and untraceable, surfacing in unexpected places, work songs that carried rhythms older than America, burial practices that honored connection rather than possession, quiet refusals to internalize inferiority, even when the world insisted upon it. Historians who later attempted to reconstruct Bellwood's past found themselves unsettled by how much was missing, because unlike other plantations whose brutality was recorded in abundance, Bellwood's records felt intentionally thinned, scrubbed of specificity, and this absence drew suspicion, leading to theories that ranged from mass escape to occult hysteria, none of which satisfied because all assumed that something extraordinary must leave extraordinary evidence, failing to understand that the most destabilizing events are often those that leave behind nothing concrete to refute or confirm them. forcing later generations to confront uncertainty rather than narrative comfort. And so Bellwood entered regional folklore not as a haunted plantation but as a contradiction, a place where hierarchy failed without revolt, where a master knelt and could not explain why, where violence rebounded inward rather than outward, and this contradiction lingered like a fault line beneath Southern history, challenging the myth that control was ever complete or resistance always visible. Emmanuel's final lesson, though never written down, became the most enduring: that power built on domination is inherently unstable, that worship born of fear corrupts both parties, and that systems collapse not when they are attacked directly, but when they are revealed as unnecessary. And this lesson traveled quietly into the future, shaping lives in ways impossible to trace, while those who tried to erase it were remembered only as footnotes in their own downfall. And so the story of Bellwood does not end with justice neatly delivered or evil dramatically punished, because history rarely offers such satisfaction. Instead, it ends with inheritance, the inheritance of silence that speaks, of absence that instructs, of knowledge that survives precisely because it refuses to be owned. And if this story unsettled you, if it made you question how many truths were buried not because they were false, but because they were dangerous to those in power, then subscribe to the Black Timeline. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next hidden chapter they never wanted remembered, and leave a comment telling us how deeply this story affected you, because every time these stories are told, what they tried to erase loses a little more of its hold.